Thanks for tuning in. I'm Scott Walter.
And I'm Michael Watson.
In this episode, big tech is in the news as government officials, left and right, threaten to censor the internet, and Facebook employees petition against the company's political monoculture. This is the InfluenceWatch podcast. This week, social media companies have been on the political hot seat. President Trump made headlines for threatening Google with some sort of government action in retaliation for what the president claims, and Google denies, is partisan manipulation of search results to make the president look bad. From the other side of the aisle, Democratic Senator Ron Wyden sent a letter recommending that Twitter categorically censor certain views, while reminding them that they had a nice platform and it would be a shame if anything happened to that. Facebook employees, meanwhile, are dissenting from what they call a, quote, political monoculture that's intolerant of different views, close quote. They launched an internal advocacy faction to push for political diversity, which itself provoked retaliatory complaints from their colleagues who claim that the group itself is offensive to minorities. These stories underline a growing debate over the power of major tech companies, specifically the social media platforms YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, the search engine Google, and the content distribution networks owned by Apple and Alphabet, which of course is the parent company of Google and YouTube. Conservatives, often with more evidence than the president's Twitter feed supplied, have suspected that the Silicon Valley giants target speech outside the left and lefter political spectrum of greater San Francisco. A few old-line anti-corporate left liberals, prominently including billionaire financial trader George Soros, have also questioned the power of the tech companies and whether that means they should be broken up as monopolies. Well, Mike, a slew of tech controversies this week. Why don't we start with the feud between the president and Google?
So on Tuesday, the President of the United States, as is his wont, woke up and got on Twitter. And his rant that day targeted Google, and the president accused, based on a methodologically extremely suspect survey by a right-wing blog outlet, claimed that Google was somehow politically manipulating for partisan ends the results when you searched for, quote, Trump news, that they were putting all the bad news up front and they were suppressing the good news, and that it was all coming from, left-wing sources or mainstream media sources. Google naturally denies outright that they do any sort of manipulation. The way that Google have said that their algorithm works, the mathematical program that spits out whatever you get when you search, is based on one of the things that counts is the number of links that go to and from a certain page, and also how long it's been on the internet. Now, obviously, for something like the New York Times gets lots of links, and it's been on the internet at nytimes.com since probably the 90s, kind of the beginning of the internet. Google begins in 98. They've probably been around for about the same amount of time. This improves its search engine optimization, its quote-unquote page rank, and this makes it look better to Google's algorithm than, a conservative blog that started a year ago. So that said, Google's algorithm has been described as a black box that only Google knows how the Google algorithm actually works. Otherwise, you could just reproduce it.
Sure. Well, on the other hand, of course, I think any conservative has heard or seen himself countless unusual things, or at least things that seem to be unusual. I can remember, for instance, some of the one of my favorites was during the last election, seeing people point out how searches related to Hillary Clinton. I mean, if you the autocomplete seemed to be unusual because things like Hillary Clinton criminal probably were being searched for a great deal, whether or not that's fair and the rest, but they certainly were, and they didn't seem to be autocompletes for things like that. But I suppose part of that you raise, though, just in what little we do know about the algorithm, you raise an issue. If I wanted to be as charitable toward Google as possible, I could say, well, look, they have set up an algorithm that's going to privilege, to use a good left-wing word, it's going to privilege large mainstream media sources. But of course, a second's reflection tells anybody, well, if we're going to privilege mainstream media sources, there may be some slant
But then
there.
the question, I mean, okay, yeah, sure, all right, so that means the New York Times is going to look good, that CNN's going to look good, that NBC News is going to look good. But one, it also means the Wall Street Journal is going to look good. It also means that Fox News is going to look reasonable. And the other question is, okay, if they're not going to use these longstanding, whether your links and how long your source has been on the web, and kind of what else are they supposed to use? And again, there have been criticisms of the Google algorithm, and there are those kind of weird coincidences, but again, it's that kind of, to me, I think before you say that, they are politically manipulating, you need a little bit more evidence.
Well, I agree. It's a tricky question. And of course, in the case of Facebook, where conservatives have lots of complaints about Facebook, at least part of the decline in Facebook passing along conservative news sources or news comment pundits. Part of the issue there is that Facebook, in its algorithm, seems to have greatly downplayed news sources of all kinds in favor of more personal type. So in other words, you're going to see more of Aunt Sally's Facebook page and less of the Daily Caller or Ben Shapiro or
Fox News or MSNBC, regardless of their political outlook, which is again Facebook's decision about how Facebook is just going to operate.
Yeah, so it's there aren't easy answers to some of this. Well, okay, let's pick another thing which I don't think counts as a feud, but rather as veiled threats, and that would be Senator Wyden versus Twitter. Tell us a bit more about that.
And this one's a real shame if you're in favor of free speech, because of the Democrats in the U.S. Senate, Ron Wyden has probably been one of the more committed to free speech on the internet. He's one of the authors of Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which basically says that if you are a platform like a Facebook, a Twitter, a YouTube, and other people post stuff on your platform, you aren't liable for anything stupid that they said.
Yeah, you've simply created a forum. You've created a public square. You've created a new public square.
You've created. It's like if you opened a bar. And if I open a bar and there's a guy sitting on the left end of the bar saying that John McCain was a Russian spy, and I got a guy sitting on the right end of the bar who's saying that Hillary Clinton should go to prison for 50 years for murdering Vince Foster, regardless of the fact that both of what they're saying is completely ludicrous, I'm not liable as the barkeep for what they're saying. You can't sue me for libel. But apparently Wyden has evolved in his thinking.
Grown
in office, evolved in his thinking, because this week it came out that he had sent a fairly threatening letter to Twitter saying that if Twitter didn't censor basically conspiracy theorist Alex Jones, if you read the text of the letter, it's quite clear that he's referring to conspiracy theorist Alex Jones and Jones's conspiracy theory that somehow the Sandy Hook and Parkland massacres were staged, that they didn't actually happen, which is absolutely ludicrous. And then probably because the person writing it was like, well, we can't make it too obvious that we're just talking about Alex Jones, let's also throw in Holocaust deniers as people who should be banned. And the underlying part of the letter was, if you don't ban these people, someone, probably not me, I swear, but someone will come and try to regulate you.
Yes, so precisely the nice little platform you've got here, be a shame if anything happened
Be a
to it.
shame if walking in, Wyden maybe is kind of the nice guy, the nice guy with the legitimate front group for the mob, who walks in with Kamala,
Vinny.
with Vinny, pick your liberal senator who is Vinny in this analogy, with the underlying problem of the underlying, threat. If you don't do what I want, bad things will happen to you.
Yeah. And by the way, I confess I was fascinated because I realized, where did that ever? I thought it came from a movie, but apparently no one is quite certain. Although it looks like the earliest known usage was a Monty Python sketch. So that was intriguing. So it's the English Army that's doing threats, not the Omerta folks. Wyden, speaking of Wyden and the regulation, we can digress for a moment maybe to talk, he's threatening new laws.
Right.
But let's take a second.
He and Trump are threatening new censorship laws because under current law, including Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, authored by Wyden before he decided to apparently evolve in his thinking, the tech companies have basically free reign over what goes on in their platforms. Go back to my analogy of the barkeep. They own the bar. If they think the two guys that I described earlier are being drunk and disorderly, they can throw them out. You can be kicked off the platform. You can be denied access to it. It is a private company. It is a private forum for free expression, like a bar. But if you're being disorderly in the eyes of the bartender or in the eyes of the bar management, they can throw you out. And also point out, again, there's no rule stating that they have to be neutral in the application, that they have to throw both guys out. They can just throw the crazy right-wing guy out, or theoretically just throw the crazy left-wing guy out. If Google decides, like the New York Times, that it wants to be a left-wing corporate publisher, well, it has free press rights. Corporations are people, my friend, as a wise man once said. So if Alphabet Incorporated, like the New York Times Company, wants to become a espouser of left-wing views, and that's what it decides to make its corporate identity, under current law, and probably, I would say, under the First Amendment, it has every right to do so.
But I have heard some people argue, though, that that if they become vigorous policers of the content on their platform, then they shouldn't be able to have the current thing that Wyden set up.
The Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which says that they're not responsible for what they publish.
A neutral platform is not responsible, but if you're not really neutral, if you're very regularly policing and you're policing in a particular direction and whatnot.
I mean, certainly that would be where a regulator who is interested in causing trouble would go, look, what point do you lose Section 230 protection as just a platform, as opposed to obviously, if the New York Times libels someone, the New York Times Corporation can be sued for it. Obviously, libel has a very strict legal standard, and I would say it should not budge. President Trump says it should be very, very wide. So the question at which point you stop being a platform and which point you start being more like the New York Times Company would be one that would have to be decided by regulators and by courts.
And for our campaign finance reform friends, I want to quickly just remind that isn't it nice and convenient that no campaign finance reform restrictions on speech apply to the New York Times Corporation?
If I were a cynic, I would suggest that the New York Times Corporation is interested in making sure that other corporations can't speak on political issues in order to maintain its monopoly on speaking on political issues.
Yes, but that's a whole. We should do a whole show on the campaign finance reform horrors. But for now, we'll stick to the high tech free speech fight. So the next fight we have to get to this week is Facebook's fight with itself. Tell us a bit more about that.
So we've seen before a couple, on these internal Silicon Valley internal company message boards, the right-wing views being sort of repressed. Obviously, the most famous example was the guy at Google who wrote that wrote that piece on differences between men and women. That was highly
James
controversial.
Damore.
Yeah, James Damore is the guy's name. Highly controversial. I won't say whether it was reasonable or not so reasonable. But however it went, he ended up being driven out of the company. Now, this week at Facebook, we find out that 100 or so, the New York Times reported up to 100, employees of Facebook, in protest of what they call a stifling, or what they call a political monoculture, which they see as stifling and creating blind spots in the company's approach and in their own ability to work. They formed one of these internal message groups, which they're calling Facebookers for Political Diversity. And they want to advocate for more tolerance and understanding of mainstream right-of-center viewpoints.
Well, that is a fascinating development. So monoculture obviously would be in contrast to multiculturalism, which, if you asked any PR flack for Facebook, I am quite sure they would preen. In fact, I bet you there are people with multicultural in their title.
It is
at the company.
It is interesting. Again, one of the why I'm a squishy person. I don't think the left is entirely wrong about how diversity, bringing in more perspectives, causes you to avoid making cultural mistakes that you maybe don't intend.
A quick example being precisely the Google thing of, well, we'll set this so that it uses mainstream media sources, and if somebody were there to say, you may have issues with that.
You could certainly say that. But again, not taking that lesson from your own ideology, and one of the parts of your ideology that maybe has a kernel of reasonableness, and then to say, oh, but when it comes to, again, mainstream political views, and whether you like it or not, 62 million people voted for President Trump. That is there were 126, 127 million votes cast. So that's slightly less than half. If you're going to say that slightly less than half of the country isn't in some way mainstream, you're ruling out a great deal of the people. You're probably ruling out some people that you know.
So when the 100 or so employees pleaded that diversity is our strength, and diversity includes political diversity, not just melanin content in the skin, they spurred a counter revolt. Is that right?
Yeah, according to the New York Times, which wrote this up, there were people within Facebook who then complained, saying that the existence of an advocacy faction for, not necessarily for right-of-center views, but just for acceptance or toleration or pluralism with respect to right-of-center views, that was somehow offensive to minorities.
And how did the company react?
The company actually reacted well. The company said that no, they haven't violated our processes. This is as of the New York Times reporting yesterday. They hadn't violated our processes. They haven't done anything. They hadn't done anything wrong. Therefore, they're allowed to keep doing this. Now, there is, because everything comes back to employment law, a little asterisk with that. Even if you don't have a union, even if you're not a unionized workplace, you have rights under the National Labor Relations Act to protected concerted activity, which means that if you and at least one of your coworkers wish to engage in certain protected activities, among them advocacy, within the company for better wages or working conditions, there are restrictions on the extent to which your employer can retaliate against you, even if you don't have a union. And to the extent that these, again, okay, we got 100, that's more than one, check, it's concerted. To the extent that they're advocating for better working conditions, and of course this would have to be adjudicated, if Facebook decided to retaliate, this would be litigated probably before a National Labor Relations Board panel. would have to decide whether that advocacy was concerning wages and working conditions, or in this case, working conditions. And if it was, then it might be protected.
The other, of course, charming thing about that is that normally our friends on the left who, hint, hint, campaign finance reformers, scoop up massive sums of money from unions, they might have a hard time attacking a group of workers.
It's a very interesting situation that kind of flips. The normal, of course, is that the center right believes that usually the company is correct, and the left usually believes that the unionized employees are correct. Even the non-unionized employees, in recent years, with things like the Fight for 15, our Walmart campaign, the unions have, realizing that people don't want to join unions anymore, has tried to do independent advocacy and advocate these. In fact, the Obama Labor Department did a public relations campaign on non-union Section 7 rights to protected concerted activity.
Plus, in its regular union organizing, the unions now will often try for the sort of micro unions. Like we can't unionize Macy's, but we've got the folks selling cosmetics.
We can unionize the cosmetic salespeople, and that's all being litigated in the labor board and is a thing for another time.
Yeah, but well, it's definitely a fascinating legal question. Now, we'd mentioned earlier at Google, James Damore's complaint. One thing he had was he was only one person.
He was only one guy, so it wasn't. I think he ended up failing on both thresholds. And it was neither protected activity on working conditions nor was it concerted.
So he didn't have other folks with him, and it was more political than working conditions.
Yeah, it was more political than working conditions, and that, I think, is why ultimately a National Labor Relations Board judge said, nah.
So that did make it to the National Labor Relations Board.
It made it to the National Labor Relations Board system. There you have, before you get to the board, the five guys in Washington, you have the administrative law judges, who are lawyers who work for the labor board, who try to apply the precedents from the five guys in Washington. So it went before an administrative law judge, and the administrative law judge ruled in favor of the company, and I think they appealed, and it didn't succeed.
Well, that's interesting in itself, and it makes one wonder whether perhaps the Facebook employees, having seen that example,
may have figured out that you need two.
Yes, let's have more, and let's focus
let's focus on working conditions rather than on theories about the sexes.
Yeah, and of course, anybody who is for the underdog is likely to have some sympathy for folks complaining about these gigantic tech monopolies, because that is part of the issue that involves, and this is they're if not legally protected monopolies, they're effectively monopolies de facto, but. There's another M word that we need to get into the discussion besides monopoly, and that's mobs. So mobs also figure in these controversies over the high-tech companies and speech. Why don't we start with some of the left-wing issues like that. One of the right's greatest complaints about Facebook is that it's supposedly biased in favor of the left. But you mentioned, I believe earlier, that one of the folks criticizing Facebook this past year has been a prominent leader on the left.
The prominentest lefty big donor of them all, George Soros. Now, I'm sure that his focus on Facebook has nothing to do with the fact that the U.S. Justice Department and U.S. intelligence believe that foreign actors were using Facebook to distribute propaganda in the 2016 elections. But whether it is because of partisan interest or from ideological opposition to monopoly, Soros gave a speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, when all the big rich guys and all the politicians go to Switzerland and talk about how wonderful they are for a week. And he proposed that the big tech companies, Facebook and Google, specifically, needed to be regulated as public utilities and broken up into their constituent parts as monopolies. If you remember net neutrality debates, we discussed that on one of our earlier shows. You'll recall that the Federal Communications Commission under Barack Obama, or during the Obama administration, used public utility regulation, the same regulation for your landline telephone, to take control of the internet service providers. Now, change of administration, change of policy, that has now been repealed. But that
to great criticism from the left, including many groups receiving big checks from George Soros.
They wanted to keep the public utility regulation in place. Now, who was one of the companies that was interested in public utility regulating the internet service providers as public utilities?
Google.
It was Google. Also, most of the content companies. Netflix was another big one. So, you know, there's a precedent on the left for trying to use public utility regulation to gain control, and even to a greater degree than they already have it, of these, whether it's the suppliers of internet, the people who own the pipes, or now the people who control the stuff going through the pipes.
Yes, which Facebook and Google are pretty massively
substantially involved in that.
Yeah, well, I want to make two quick points on that, and one is that obviously at InfluenceWatch, InfluenceWatch.org, we're constantly talking about the big influencers and special interests and the rest, and one of the annoying things to me about the left is that they don't really like business as a prejudice. So they're always attacking business, and on something like a net neutrality, they will jump on businesses and say, we've got to do this because we've got to throttle these dangerous, bad businesses with this regulation, when in fact, of course, an honest look at the full policy involved is, hey, there's a bunch of businesses that want this regulation, and there's a bunch of businesses that don't.
Businesses who are hurt by it who don't want it. There are businesses who are helped by it who want it.
Yes.
And what you're ultimately doing is deciding between two factions of
businesses. You are not remotely anti-business. You're some business against other business.
You're pro-businesses who give you campaign contributions.
Yes, so that's the important thing. The other important thing to me is that since the rise of Barack Obama, it has always baffled me how young people think that he was sold as hope and change, and it's all new and wonderful, when in fact, because net neutrality was one of the biggest things he wanted, and by the way, that's in itself quite an amazingly dirty story.
Go watch our show on that.
But yeah, go see the full net neutrality show, because there's all kinds of dirty machinations involved in that. But again, just on the face of it, you have this obvious thing. We're going to take the internet, this wonderful 21st century, Wild West, freedom, make your own thing,
and we're going to regulate it like 1930s telephones.
Yes, and it's going to be regulated like AT&T's phone company monopoly in 1930. That does not strike me as a wonderfully futuristic, glorious future. But anyway, let's and then now I lie. I have a third point, which is that it is interesting that Soros is harshly criticizing Facebook and also calling for regulations of public utility. Now, I confess, if one were cynical about Mr. Soros, as a few of my acquaintances are, you might wonder, well, he looks like a great guy by criticizing them, but on the other hand, if his solution is simply to turn them into a government-regulated utility, then the party of government, the left,
may stand somewhat to benefit.
Yeah.
Now, far be it from me to say that he might have a point, but when one of the things that he spoke about in his speech to Davos was he was concerned that, as Google has announced, has said, or it's been reported, that Google is trying to work with the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese Communist government to create a product of Google that can be used